The sheriff's deputy looked across the dining room table, then back at my brother-in-law. "Mr. Collins," he said slowly, "are you telling me this house belongs to you?" Rick swallowed hard, because sitting right beside the deputy was a stack of county records, bank documents, and one very angry attorney. And every single page proved he had lied for months, maybe years. Across the room, his mother stopped chewing. His father stared at the floor. My sister Emily sat quietly beside me, her hands folded in her lap. 24 hours earlier, she'd been outside in 38 degrees weather, crying alone on Thanksgiving. Now Rick was the one shaking. And the best part, he still didn't know how much trouble he was really in. But to explain how we got there, I need to take you back to the Thanksgiving text message that changed everything. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 66 years old, retired from 38 years in the electrical trade, and I live in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. I've never been the kind of man who goes looking for trouble. Most folks my age understand something younger people often don't. Peace is valuable. When you've lived long enough, buried parents, buried friends, raised children, paid mortgages, survived layoffs, and watched life humble everyone, eventually, you stop chasing drama. You start appreciating quiet mornings and ordinary days. That's why what happened to my sister still bothers me. Not because of the money, not because of the house, because somebody she loved used her kindness against her. And that's something I cannot stand. Emily is my younger sister by 7 years. Growing up, she was the cheerful one, the peacemaker. If two kids were fighting on the playground, Emily was the child trying to get them to shake hands. If somebody forgot their lunch, she'd split hers in half. Even at 59 years old, she still had that same heart. Especially after our parents passed away. Dad died first. Mom followed 3 years later. Losing them changed both of us. Family became more important. Holidays became sacred. Every Thanksgiving for nearly 20 years, Emily hosted dinner. Didn't matter whether there were 10 people or 30. Everyone came to Emily's house. That house meant something. Our father had built part of the back deck himself. Mom planted the maple tree in the front yard. Every room carried memories. After Mom died, ownership passed entirely to Emily. The mortgage had long been paid off. The house belonged to her free and clear. At the time, none of us imagined that fact would become important. 3 years before all this happened, Emily met Rick Collins. At first, everybody liked him, including me. He was polite, friendly, always smiling, worked as a contractor, brought flowers, opened doors, remembered birthdays. You know, the type, the kind of man who seems almost too good to be true. Turns out there was a reason for that. But back then, we didn't know. The wedding was small, beautiful. Emily looked happier than she'd looked in years. I remember standing beside her afterward. "You deserve this," I told her. She squeezed my hand. "I think I finally found my person." Those words came back to haunt me later. The first year seemed fine. Then little things started changing. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice. Emily stopped calling as often. When I invited her to lunch, she was suddenly busy. Family gatherings became harder to schedule. Rick usually answered questions directed at her. Not aggressively, just often enough to feel strange. Whenever someone mentioned it, Emily laughed it off. "Oh, that's just Rick. Maybe we wanted to believe her. Maybe we didn't want to see warning signs." Either way, life moved on. Then Thanksgiving arrived. The message came at 9:12 that morning. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Emily. 3 short sentences. "Don't come. I'm busy. Happy Thanksgiving." I stared at the screen. Something felt wrong immediately. No heart emoji, no warmth, no explanation, just cold. Emily had never spoken like that in her life. I called her. No answer. I texted back. Nothing. A few hours later, I tried again. Still nothing. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling. People call it intuition. Maybe it's experience. When you've known somebody for 60 years, you recognize when something isn't right. Around 5, I grabbed my coat. My daughter Sarah happened to call as I was leaving. Heading to Emily's? She asked. Yeah, you got the text too. That stopped me. You did, Sarah sighed. Same thing, word for word. Now I knew something was definitely wrong. I drove across town under gray November skies. The roads were quiet. Most families were already gathered around dinner tables. Lights glowed through windows. You could smell turkey and wood smoke drifting through neighborhoods. Everything looked peaceful until I pulled into Emily's driveway. At first, I didn't see her. I noticed the cars. 5 of them. Rick's truck. A couple vehicles I recognized from his family. Then I saw movement near the back of the house. I got out and walked around the side yard, and there she was sitting alone on a patio chair. No coat, no gloves, just a light sweater. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face red from crying. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. This was Thanksgiving. Her Thanksgiving. Her house. And she was outside alone, shivering. When she looked up and saw me, fresh tears filled her eyes. Daniel. Her voice cracked. I rushed toward her. Emily, what happened? She tried speaking. Couldn't. She just started crying harder. Then, through the kitchen window behind her, I saw them. Rick, his parents, his brother, his sister-in-law, all sitting around Emily's dining room table, laughing, eating, passing dishes, celebrating like royalty, while the woman who owned the house sat outside in the cold. And when Rick's mother raised a wine glass and laughed at something across the table, something inside me hardened because I knew right then this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something very ugly had been happening in that house, and I was finally about to find out what it was. I took off my coat and wrapped it around Emily's shoulders. She didn't argue. That alone scared me. My sister had always been stubborn about accepting help, even as a little girl. If she scraped her knee, she'd insist she was fine. If she was hurting, she'd smile through it. Seeing her sit there trembling under my coat felt wrong in a way I can't fully describe. I pulled up a chair beside her. Talk to me. For a few seconds, she just stared at the ground. The sounds of laughter drifted through the kitchen window behind us. Forks clinked kegged against plates. Someone laughed loudly. I saw Emily flinch. Then she whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. They told me I was ruining Thanksgiving. I stared at her. What? Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. They said I was making everyone uncomfortable. The words hit me harder than I expected. I looked back toward the house. Inside, Rick was carving turkey. Like the king of the castle, like he owned the place, like the woman sitting outside wasn't even part of the family. I forced myself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help Emily. Not yet. What happened? She took a shaky breath, then another, and slowly the truth began to come out. Not all at once, piece by piece, like someone emptying years of pain from a suitcase. It didn't start this way, she said. I know he wasn't always like this. I nodded because I believed her. People often ask why victims stay, why they don't leave sooner. But life isn't that simple. Most controlling people don't show their true selves immediately. If they did, nobody would stay. Instead, they change gradually, one small step at a time. Looking back, Emily could see it clearly. But living through it had been different. The first year after the wedding seemed normal. Rick handled home repairs, managed projects around the house, cooked dinner occasionally. Everyone thought he was helpful, including Emily. Then he started making suggestions, harmless ones, or so they seemed. You shouldn't stress about bills. I can handle the finances. Let me organize the paperwork. You're working too hard. Little things, reasonable things, things that sounded caring. And Emily trusted him. After all, he was her husband. Why wouldn't she? So, she gave him access to household accounts. She let him organize filing cabinets. She let him manage incoming mail. At first, it even felt helpful until it wasn't. Over time, she stopped seeing certain documents. Bank statements disappeared. Insurance paperwork disappeared. Property tax notices disappeared. Whenever she asked, Rick had an answer, already handed. Not because I'd never heard stories like this, because I had too many times the details change. The pattern rarely does. Control disguised as love, dependence disguised as support, isolation disguised as protection. When did you realize something was wrong? I asked. Emily laughed bitterly. It barely sounded like her. About a year ago. What happened? He got angry. About what? Nothing. That answer told me everything. People in healthy relationships don't explode over nothing, but controlling people often do. According to Emily, it started with a church fundraiser. She had volunteered without asking Rick first. When she got home, he wasn't yelling. That would have been easier. Instead, he spent 3 days acting cold, 3 days of silence, 3 days of guilt, 3 days of making her feel like she'd betrayed him. Eventually, she apologized for volunteering. Even now, she looked embarrassed admitting it. I understood why. Nobody likes admitting they were manipulated, especially intelligent people. But intelligence has nothing to do with it. Trust does, and Emily trusted the wrong person. The deeper she got into the story, the worse it became. Rick slowly criticized her friends, then her coworkers, then family members, always indirectly, always politely, never enough to sound outrageous, just enough to create distance. Your brother means well, but he interferes. Your daughter is judgmental. People take advantage of your kindness. The message was always the same. Everyone else was the problem. Only Rick could be trusted. Classic isolation, classic control. And somehow none of us saw it happening. I still carry guilt about that. Maybe I always will. The November wind picked up. I adjusted my coat around her shoulders. Inside the house, the dinner continued. Nobody had even checked on her. Not once. That fact alone made my blood boil. Then Emily pointed toward the dining room. Look! I followed her gaze. The curtains weren't completely closed. Through the gap, I could see papers spread across the table. Several folders, documents, stacks of paperwork. At first, they looked ordinary. Then, I noticed Rick's father examining one page very carefully. His mother leaned over his shoulder. Rick was pointing at something, explaining, smiling, and suddenly I understood why those papers mattered. Are those house documents? Emily nodded slowly, fearfully, as though saying it aloud made it real. What kind? I don't know. You haven't looked. They won't let me. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. They won't let you. It always turns into a fight. I stared at her. This was her house. Her house? The one she'd inherited from our parents, the one she'd owned years before Rick ever appeared. And somehow she'd reached a point where she felt she needed permission to see documents related to her own property. I felt something shift inside me, a line being crossed, a line I couldn't ignore. Emily, she looked at me. Tell me exactly what happened today. She wiped her eyes, took a breath, and started talking. Thanksgiving morning. Rick's family arrived early around 9. His mother immediately took over the kitchen. His father started discussing finances. At first, everything seemed normal. Then the comments began. Little jabs, criticism, complaints. Nothing Emily did was right. The turkey wasn't seasoned enough. The table wasn't arranged correctly. The house needed updating. The living room furniture looked old. The criticism went on for hours. Then came the real attack. Rick's mother casually suggested selling the house. My stomach tightened, Emily continued. Apparently, Rick had been discussing it with his family for months. They believed the property was too valuable, too large, too difficult to maintain. Selling would benefit everyone, especially Rick, especially his plans, especially his future. Noticeably, nobody mentioned Emily's future or her wishes or her ownership. When she objected, the mood changed instantly. Rick became angry. His mother became cruel. His father joined in. Before long, all three were pressuring her, talking over her, dismissing her, treating her like a child. Then came the final insult. Rick's mother looked her in the eye and said, If you can't be pleasant, maybe you shouldn't sit at the family table. I clenched my jaw. Emily looked away. I thought Rick would defend me. He didn't. No. What did he do? She laughed again. That painful laugh. He told me maybe I should go outside and calm down. I closed my eyes. For a second, I couldn't trust myself to speak because suddenly everything made sense. The text message, the silence, the tears, the cold, the humiliation. It wasn't about Thanksgiving. It was about power, and they wanted her to feel powerless. Then Emily said the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that transformed my concern into determination. I think they're trying to take my house. The wind seemed to stop. The laughter inside felt distant. I looked through that window again, at Rick, at the documents, at the people enjoying a feast inside a home that wasn't theirs. And for the first time that evening, I stopped thinking like a worried brother. I started thinking like a man preparing for a fight. Not a physical one, a legal one, a careful one. A fight they would never see coming. Because if Rick Collins thought he was going to steal my sister's home, he had picked the wrong family. The first thing I did was get Emily out of there. Not tomorrow. Not after another argument. Not after another holiday, ruined by people who treated her like an inconvenience. Right then, "Come on," I said. She looked toward the house. "My things are inside. We'll get them later. Rick will be angry." I leaned forward. Emily listened to me carefully. She met my eyes. For the first time all evening, I saw how exhausted she really was. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had spent years carrying a weight she no longer had the strength to hold. "Rick can be as angry as he wants." I said, "You're coming home with me." For a second, she looked uncertain. Then she nodded. And that small nod may have been the bravest thing she did all year. We walked to my truck together. Halfway there, the back door of the house opened. Rick stepped outside. The moment he saw us, his smile disappeared. Not completely. Just enough. Like a man realizing something wasn't going according to plan. "Daniel." I kept walking. "Rick, everything okay?" The nerve of him almost made me laugh. Emily had been sitting outside crying for who knows how long, and he was asking if everything was okay. "Does it look okay?" I asked. He glanced at Emily, then back at me. "She's upset. That's obvious. We had a disagreement." I opened the passenger door. Rick moved a little closer. "Emily?" His voice changed. Soft, patient. The voice of a man trying to appear reasonable. "Let's talk inside." Emily didn't move. That seemed to surprise him. For years, she'd probably done exactly what he wanted. "Not tonight, Emily," he repeated. Still nothing. Finally, she climbed into the truck. And for the first time, I saw genuine concern flicker across his face. Not concerned for her, concerned for himself, because control depends on access. And suddenly, he was losing both. I drove away without another word. The entire trip to my house was quiet. Emily stared out the window. I kept both hands on the steering wheel. The anger inside me was growing. But anger without direction is useless. I needed facts, not assumptions, proof, not suspicions. By the time we reached my house, I already knew who I was calling. His name was Frank Bennett, 72 years old, retired attorney, family friend, the kind of man who could quote property law the way other people quote baseball statistics. Frank had known our parents for decades. He'd helped settle both estates after Mom and Dad passed away. Most importantly, he knew every detail regarding Emily's house. I called him that night. To my surprise, he answered immediately. "Happy Thanksgiving," he said. "Not exactly." His tone changed instantly. "What happened?" I told him everything. The text, the crying, the documents, the pressure to sell, the strange behavior, the isolation. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Frank said something that made my stomach tighten. "Daniel, has Emily signed anything recently?" I looked toward the living room. Emily sat quietly on my couch, holding a cup of coffee, staring into space. "I don't know. Find out why." Another pause. because this doesn't sound like a family disagreement. What does it sound like? It sounds like somebody may be preparing a property transfer. I felt cold, even standing inside my own warm kitchen. The next morning, Frank came over. He arrived carrying a legal pad, 2 folders, and the expression of a man who already suspected the worst. For nearly 3 hours, he spoke with Emily, patiently, carefully, never rushing, never judging. Slowly, more pieces fell into place. Over the previous 18 months, Rick had presented numerous documents for her signature. Some she remembered, some she barely recalled. Most had supposedly involved taxes, insurance, refinancing options, or estate planning. Each time, Rick had reassured her. It's routine. It's nothing. Just sign here. Frank's face became harder with every answer. Finally, he asked a simple question. Do you have copies? Emily shook her head. No. None. No. Frank leaned back. The room fell silent. Then he looked at me, and I knew exactly what he was thinking. This was bad. Very bad. The next step involved gathering records. Fortunately, county records don't care about lies. Paper trails have a way of telling the truth. By Monday morning, Frank had already begun pulling public documents. What we found wasn't criminal, at least not yet. But it was alarming. Several inquiries had been made regarding the property's title. There had been discussions with lenders, requests for information, preliminary paperwork. Nothing finalized, nothing completed. But enough activity to raise serious questions. When Frank explained everything, Emily looked physically ill. You mean he was actually trying to do it? We don't know that yet, Frank replied carefully. But we know somebody was exploring options, and that somebody wasn't me. No. The following week brought another surprise. Actually, several. The first came from one of Emily's neighbors, a widow named Carol, 70 years old, sharp as a tack. She'd lived next door for nearly 20 years. When she learned Emily was staying with me, she called. About time, she said. What do you mean? I asked. That man. My grip tightened on the phone. What about him? Carol hesitated, then sighed. I never wanted to interfere. Interfere with what? The way he treated her. Over the next 20 minutes, Carol described things that made my blood pressure rise. Arguments, criticism, public embarrassment, control. Nothing dramatic enough for police. Nothing obvious enough to trigger intervention, but together a disturbing pattern. And Carol wasn't the only one. Another neighbor called, then another, then someone from church, then an old coworker of Emily's. Individually, each story seemed small. Collectively, they painted a picture. Rick wasn't controlling only inside the house. People had noticed it everywhere. The frightening part, Emily hadn't, or maybe she had, but she no longer trusted herself enough to challenge it. That's what emotional manipulation does. It doesn't just control your actions. It damages your confidence until eventually you doubt your own judgment. One evening, about a week after Thanksgiving, Emily and I sat on my back porch. The air smelled like wood smoke. Christmas lights glowed across neighboring houses. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she asked a question. Do you think I'm stupid? I turned toward her. What? She looked embarrassed. For letting this happen. The sadness in her voice hit me hard because that question wasn't really about intelligence. It was about shame. And shame is often the last weapon abusers leave behind. No, I said. She stared at the yard. I should have seen it. No. I should have known. No, then why didn't I? I thought about that for a moment, then answered honestly. Because good people assume other people are good. A tear slipped down her cheek. You trusted your husband, I continued. That's not stupidity. What is it? It's normal. The porch remained quiet. Then I added the part she needed to hear most. The person who should feel ashamed is the one who abused that trust. She cried then. Not loudly, just enough. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, those tears felt different. Less like defeat, more like healing. 3 days later, Frank called. His voice sounded unusually serious. Daniel, what is it? I found something. My heart immediately sped up. What? A signature? I stood from my chair. What kind of signature? One that doesn't look right. The silence that followed seemed endless. Then Frank said the words that changed everything. I think your brother-in-law may have committed fraud. And suddenly, the fight we'd been preparing for became far more dangerous than any of us imagined. The moment Frank said the word fraud, I felt the room get smaller. Not physically, emotionally. The situation had already been bad enough. A controlling husband, a vulnerable wife, a family trying to pressure her into giving up her home. But fraud? That crossed into entirely different territory. What exactly did you find? I asked. Frank lowered his voice. We were speaking on the phone, but I could tell he was choosing every word carefully. I found a signature on a document filed during a title inquiry. My stomach tightened. Emily's supposedly. Supposedly, it doesn't match. I sat down slowly. Across the room, Emily was decorating a small Christmas tree with my granddaughter. For the first time in weeks, she looked peaceful. I wasn't eager to destroy that peace. What happens now? I asked. We verify. How? We gather evidence. That became our focus. Evidence, not assumptions, not anger. Evidence. Because if there was one thing I'd learned over 6 decades of life, it was this. Truth wins more battles than emotion. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank worked quietly. He requested records, reviewed filings, compared signatures, examined dates. Meanwhile, Emily continued staying at my house. Rick called constantly. At first, his messages sounded concerned, then frustrated, then demanding, eventually threatening. Not direct threats. People like Rick are usually smarter than that. Instead, he used guilt, manipulation, pressure. The same tools he'd used for years. You're overreacting. Your brother is turning you against me. We need to talk. You're embarrassing me. You owe me an explanation. The messages never asked how she was feeling, never apologized, never acknowledged Thanksgiving. Everything revolved around him. That told me everything I needed to know. One evening, Emily handed me her phone. Listen to this. A voicemail. Rick's voice filled the room. At first, he sounded calm. Then came the real message. Emily, if you keep involving lawyers, people are going to get the wrong impression. I looked at her, she looked at me. Neither of us missed the implication. He wasn't worried about fixing the marriage. He was worried about being exposed. 3 days later, Frank called another meeting. This time, he arrived smiling. Not a happy smile. The smile of a man who finally had answers. I've got it. Emily looked nervous. I felt the same. Frank placed several documents on my dining room table. Then he began explaining. The signature wasn't a perfect forgery. In fact, it wasn't even a very good one. The problem was that nobody had looked closely until now. When compared side by side with verified signatures, the differences became obvious. Stroke patterns, letter spacing, pressure points, small details, but enough. More importantly, Frank had discovered something else, something even bigger. Rick had been meeting with a lender multiple times using information connected to Emily's property without her knowledge, without her participation, without her permission. The room became very quiet. What was he trying to do? Emily finally asked. Frank folded his hands. It appears he was exploring ways to leverage the property. Emily stared at him. You mean borrow against it? Possibly. Without telling me, Frank nodded. A tear rolled down her cheek. Not because of the money, because of the betrayal. I understood that the financial damage could have been repaired. Trust was harder. Trust always is. Then Frank looked directly at me. I think it's time for what? To stop reacting. What do you mean? His smile returned. This time it looked dangerous. I think it's time to let Rick know we know. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to satisfaction. Not revenge. Not yet, but momentum. The following Saturday provided the perfect opportunity. Rick's parents were hosting an early Christmas gathering. Several relatives would be there. Friends, neighbors, people who knew the family. People who had spent years listening to Rick present himself as a hardworking husband and devoted provider. Frank suggested we attend. Emily looked terrified. I understood why. Walking into that room would require courage, but hiding wasn't helping anymore. And frankly, I was tired of letting Rick control the narrative. So, we went. The moment we arrived, the atmosphere changed. Conversations slowed. People stared. Rick certainly wasn't expecting us. His expression alone was worth the drive. For half a second, pure panic crossed his face. Then the smile returned. The same practice smile, the same performance. Emily, she nodded politely. Nothing more. That seemed to bother him. Good. For the next hour, we mingled, talked, listened, observed. Frank remained calm, patient, almost cheerful, which worried me slightly. Because I'd learned something about attorneys. The calmer they become, the more dangerous the situation usually is. Eventually, Rick approached. Can we talk? Emily looked toward Frank, then toward me. Finally, she answered, no. Simple, firm, final. The expression on Rick's face was priceless. Because for years, she'd probably explained, defended, justified, apologized. Now she simply said no and walked away. Control slipped a little further through his fingers. Then Frank made his move. Subtle at first, a conversation here. A question there. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. By the end of the evening, several relatives had heard certain facts. Facts that were difficult to explain away. Property inquiries, questionable paperwork, missing signatures, legal concerns. Nobody accused Rick publicly. Nobody needed to. Truth has a way of creating its own gravity. People began asking questions. Awkward questions. The kind manipulative people hate. I watched Rick's confidence slowly unravel. His father looked confused. His sister looked concerned. His mother looked angry. Very angry. At one point, she cornered Emily near the kitchen. I happened to be close enough to hear. This is family business. Emily surprised all of us, including herself. No, she said calmly. It's my house. The older woman froze. Emily continued. And my business. Then she walked away. I don't think I've ever been prouder of my sister. Not when she graduated college. Not when she bought her first home. Not even at her wedding. Because that moment represented something bigger. She was finally finding her voice again. The gathering ended awkwardly. People left early. Questions remained unanswered. Rumors spread. And Rick knew exactly where those rumors were coming from. The next morning, he appeared at my front door, angry, desperate, cornered. I stepped outside before he could enter. What are you doing? He demanded. I folded my arms. Enjoying my Sunday. You've poisoned her against me. No. You have. No, Rick. I looked him directly in the eye. The truth did that. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. Gone was the charming husband. Gone was the smiling family man. Standing in front of me was a man who realized his plan was collapsing, and he was terrified. What he didn't know was that things were about to get much worse, because 2 days later, the county investigator assigned to review the questionable documents called Frank, and after reviewing the evidence, they decided the matter warranted official attention. The game was over. Now the consequences were beginning. People often imagine justice arriving with dramatic courtroom speeches, or police cars or handcuffs. Real life usually isn't like that. Most of the time, justice arrives slowly. One document, one phone call, one uncomfortable truth at a time. And that's exactly how Rick Collins' world began to collapse. The county investigator started by reviewing the paperwork Frank had collected. Every signature, every filing, every inquiry, every date. The process took weeks, weeks that felt like months. Meanwhile, Christmas came and went. For the first time in years, Emily spent the holiday surrounded by people who actually cared about her. My children came over. The grandkids filled the house with noise. Neighbors stopped by with cookies and casseroles. Church friends visited. Nobody pressured her. Nobody criticized her. Nobody told her she was ruining anything. And slowly I began seeing pieces of my sister return. The old Emily, the woman we'd all missed. One afternoon she was helping my granddaughter build a gingerbread house. The little girl accidentally knocked one side down. Immediately she burst into tears. Emily smiled. "It's okay, but I ruined it." "No, sweetheart." Emily carefully picked up the fallen piece. "You just have to rebuild it." I watched from across the room, and for a second, I wasn't sure whether she was talking to my granddaughter or herself. Maybe both. A few days after New Year's, Frank called. His tone was unusually upbeat. "I have news." Good news had become rare enough that my heart immediately sped up. "What happened?" "The investigation is moving forward." "That's good." "It's very good." Apparently, several documents had raised serious concerns. Enough concerns that additional reviews were being conducted. Certain explanations Rick had provided didn't match available records. Certain signatures remained questionable. Most importantly, investigators now had enough information to start asking difficult questions. Questions Rick couldn't easily answer. For the first time, official pressure was being applied. And people like Rick hate scrutiny, especially when they've spent years controlling the narrative. A week later, we saw proof. Rick started calling again. Not Emily, me. The first voicemail sounded angry. The second sounded defensive. The third sounded scared. By the sixth message, panic was obvious. I didn't return any of them. Neither did Emily. There was nothing left to discuss. The facts would speak for themselves. Then came the next surprise. Rick's own family started turning on him. Not all of them, but enough. His sister called Emily one afternoon. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When it ended, Emily looked emotionally exhausted. "What happened?" I asked. She sat quietly for a moment, then shook her head. She didn't know. Know what? Most of it. Apparently, Rick had told different stories to different people. Some relatives believed Emily wanted to sell the house. Others believed she was struggling financially. A few thought she planned to move away. Nobody had been given the complete truth. Classic manipulation. Keep everyone confused. Keep everyone separated. Keep everyone dependent on your version of events. But once the lies started unraveling, they unraveled quickly. Several family members realized they had been used. Others felt embarrassed. Some were angry. A few even apologized directly to Emily, not because they had actively harmed her, because they had remained silent. And silence often helps bad behavior survive. One snowy afternoon in late January, Emily received another call. This one changed everything. It was from the investigator. The conversation wasn't long, but afterward she sat motionless at the kitchen table. I poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her. What did they say? She stared into her mug, then finally looked up. They found enough evidence. I waited. They're moving forward. The relief on her face was overwhelming. Not excitement, relief. The kind that comes after carrying fear for too long. The kind that makes your shoulders lighter, your breathing easier, your future feel possible again. For months, she'd worried nobody would believe her. Now someone finally did, and that mattered. More than money, more than property, more than revenge. Validation matters. Being heard matters. Being believed matters. The following weeks brought additional consequences for Rick. Financial, Lego, professional. I won't pretend every detail was dramatic. Real life rarely is, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Business relationships suffered. Reputation suffered. Trust disappeared. People who once accepted his stories began questioning them. And once credibility is gone, it's difficult to recover. Very difficult. Meanwhile, Emily focused on rebuilding. Therapy helped more than either of us expected. At first, she resisted. Then she embraced it. Every session seemed to make her stronger, more confident, more self-assured. One evening, she told me something I'd never forget. "I don't miss him." I looked up from my newspaper. "What do you mean?" She smiled sadly. "I miss who I thought he was." That sentence stayed with me because it captured the entire tragedy perfectly. She wasn't mourning the man. She was mourning the illusion, the future she'd imagined, the promises she'd believed, the life she'd hoped for. Sometimes healing begins when we finally separate reality from fantasy. A few weeks later, she returned home. Her home, legally protected, financially secure, entirely hers. I helped carry boxes inside. The house looked different somehow. Not physically, emotionally, lighter, cleaner, healthier. As we finished unloading the last box, Emily stood in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the front windows. For several seconds, she simply looked around. Then, she smiled. A genuine smile. The first one I'd seen in a very long time. I forgot what peace felt like. I nodded. So did I. Then came the final surprise. About a month later, Rick requested a meeting, not through Emily, through attorneys. Everything official. Everything documented. Emily debated whether to attend. Eventually, she agreed. Not for closure, not for reconciliation, for herself. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When she returned, I expected anger. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "What happened?" I asked. She sat down slowly. He apologized. That surprised me. Real apology. She considered the question carefully. "I don't know. What did he say?" "He admitted he lied." I stayed silent. "He admitted he manipulated me." Still silent, and for the first time, he didn't blame anyone else. That part surprised me most. People like Rick usually cling to excuses. Maybe consequences had finally forced honesty, or maybe he simply ran out of people to fool. Either way, it no longer mattered, because Emily wasn't waiting for his apology anymore. She had already started healing. And that's when I realized something important. The greatest punishment Rick faced wasn't legal. It wasn't financial. It wasn't public embarrassment. It was losing access to the woman who had loved him despite everything. And he knew it. The chapter was ending. But one final lesson still remained. A lesson neither of us fully understood yet. One that would arrive exactly 1 year after the Thanksgiving that changed everything. The next Thanksgiving arrived faster than I expected. Maybe that's what happens when life finally settles down. For months, things had been quiet. No investigations, no attorneys calling, no surprise documents appearing in mailboxes, just ordinary life. And after everything we'd been through, ordinary felt like a gift. A year earlier, I'd found my sister sitting outside in the cold, crying alone, while strangers enjoyed a feast inside her own home. Now, I was pulling into the same driveway under a bright November sky. The maple tree Mom planted years ago had shed most of its leaves. The front porch was decorated with pumpkins and mums, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt like home again. When I stepped inside, I immediately heard laughter. Real laughter. Not the forced kind. Not the tense kind people use when they're trying to pretend everything is okay. This was genuine, warm, comfortable. The smell of turkey filled the air. Grandchildren ran through the living room. Football played softly on the television. Friends from church chatted in the kitchen. Neighbors carried in desserts. Everything felt exactly the way Thanksgiving is supposed to feel. Emily walked out carrying a tray of rolls. For a second, I simply stared at her, not because she looked different, because she looked like herself again. There was confidence in her posture, peace in her expression, strength in her eyes. The woman who had spent years apologizing for existing was gone. The woman standing in front of me no longer needed permission to take up space. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked. I smiled. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit," I laughed. "Some things never change, and thank God for that." As guests continued arriving, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened during the previous year. The legal matters had eventually reached their conclusion. The property remained fully protected. The questionable paperwork had been addressed. The investigations ended with consequences that followed Rick for a very long time, exactly as they should have. Justice had been served, not dramatically, not publicly, but fairly. which is usually better. The truth is, revenge means different things to different people. When I was younger, I thought revenge meant making someone suffer, making them hurt the way they hurt you, making them pay. Age has a way of changing your perspective. At 66, I understand something I didn't understand at 26. The best revenge is often recovery. The best revenge is building a good life after someone tried to destroy it. The best revenge is refusing to become bitter. And Emily had accomplished all three. Around noon, guests began gathering around the dining room table, the same dining room, the same house, but an entirely different atmosphere. Nobody controlled the conversation. Nobody criticized. Nobody dominated. People simply enjoyed being together. Before we started eating, Emily stood. Immediately, the room became quiet. She looked around at everyone, friends, family, neighbors, people who had helped her survive one of the hardest periods of her life. Then she cleared her throat. "I want to say something." Several people smiled. A few nodded. Emily took a deep breath. "Last Thanksgiving was the worst day I've had in many years." The room remained silent. Not uncomfortable. Respectful. "I spent a long time feeling embarrassed about that." She paused. "A long time feeling ashamed." I could see emotions moving across several faces around the table. Because many of us knew exactly what she meant. Shame has a way of attaching itself to people who don't deserve it. I kept asking myself what I should have done differently. Her voice softened. What warning signs I missed, what mistakes I made. Then she smiled. "But healing taught me something." She looked directly at me, then at my daughter, then at her friends, then around the room. "You are not responsible for somebody else's decision to mistreat you." Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The truth of those words filled the room. You are responsible for what happens next. Several people wiped away tears, including me, especially me, because I knew how hard she had fought to reach that understanding, Emily continued. And what happened next for me was this. She gestured toward everyone seated around the table. People showed up. Her eyes glistened. My brother showed up. I looked down immediately. I've never been comfortable being the center of attention. My family showed up. My friends showed up. My neighbors showed up. She laughed softly. And apparently a retired attorney showed up. Everyone laughed, including Frank, who looked very pleased with himself. Then Emily said the sentence that mattered most. "The reason I'm happy today isn't because I won." She paused. "It's because I learned I wasn't alone." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then everyone applauded. Not loudly, just enough. The kind of applause that comes from the heart. Dinner followed. Stories were shared. Old memories resurfaced. Children laughed. Desserts disappeared. And for the first time in years, nobody felt the need to walk on eggshells. Later that evening, after most guests had left, Emily handed me an envelope. "What's this?" "It came last month." I opened it carefully. The return address surprised me. "Rick!" I looked up. "You want me to read it?" She nodded. The letter wasn't long, and unlike every message he'd sent during the previous years, it contained no excuses, no blame, no manipulation, no requests, just accountability. He acknowledged what he'd done, the damage he'd caused, the trust he'd broken, and the people he'd hurt. Most importantly, he accepted responsibility. When I finished reading, I placed the letter back inside the envelope. "How do you feel?" Emily thought about it, then smiled. "I forgave him." I raised an eyebrow. She laughed. "Not for him." That made sense. Then for who? For me. We sat quietly for a moment, watching the last colors of sunset fade through the living room windows. Finally, she spoke again. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. No, it doesn't mean trusting again. No, it just means refusing to carry the weight forever." I nodded. Because she was right. Forgiveness isn't surrender. Sometimes it's freedom. As darkness settled outside, I looked around the house one final time. The photographs, the furniture, the memories, the family, and I realized something. A house is not a home because your name is on the deed. A home is built by the people inside it, by kindness, by respect, by love, and those things can never be stolen by paperwork. That Thanksgiving, I thought I was rescuing my sister. Looking back, we were really rescuing each other from fear, from silence, from the mistaken belief that family should tolerate abuse simply because it comes from someone they love. It shouldn't. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or if you've ever had to find the courage to stand up for yourself or someone you love, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on that journey. And if this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who may need the reminder that they are not alone. Thank you for spending this time with us. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other.